The world ridiculed the P-47 as a flying brick until the day the German pilots realized they were outgunned. But that was far more humiliating, because inside that huge, heavy, useless machine was a trick of physics that no Allied manual taught. A move so simple that it could make this giant monster swoop from the sky and tear apart fighters that were supposed to be superior to it in every way. And by the time the Luftwaffe realized what was happening, it was too late. They finally understood why their best pilots kept dying. While this absurd plane became the scariest thing they could see above 6,000 meters, German pilots had spent months joking about the P-47. To them, it wasn't a fighter, just an overweight mistake with wings. A machine that climbed like an elevator with its cables cut and turned with all the grace of a wounded ox. When they saw one limping across the sky, they didn't tense up or switch tactics. They smirked, they tightened formation, they hunted. On paper, the Germans were right. The P-47 was the heaviest single-engine fighter any Air Force had ever put into service. It burned fuel like a furnace, shook violently at low speeds, and punished pilots who tried to dogfight with anything smaller than a bomber. Even American crews joked about it behind closed doors, calling it a barrel, a brick, sometimes worse. But high above Germany, on that cold morning, the jokes began to die. The pilot sitting inside that flying mistake could see nearly 40 German fighters rising in a disciplined wall of steel and perfect symmetry. They weren't improvising. They were performing a maneuver they had practiced hundreds of times, an upward trap designed to peel apart escort fighters and then carve into the bombers behind them. Against nimble aircraft like the Spitfire, the tactic was risky. Against a P-47, they believed it was guaranteed victory. The radio crackled with warning, but the American pilot didn't need it. He saw the trap forming. He saw the angles collapsing. He knew what every rulebook insisted. A P-47 caught at altitude by superior numbers should disengage immediately. But he also knew something the manuals didn't. He eased the throttle, feeling the airframe tense as if bracing itself for a blow. The Germans assumed he was hesitating. They assumed they had scared him. Their formation tightened, predators closing in for the kill. Then he did the unthinkable. He shoved the stick forward and sent the massive fighter nose down into a dive so violent that even he felt the instinctive terror in his chest. The wings trembled. The engine howled. Air screamed across the fuselage as the altimeter spun like a falling coin. The Germans didn't laugh now. They hesitated. Because the P-47 wasn't dropping, it was vanishing. What they saw instead was a streak, a blur, a weight of metal accelerating faster than their own aircraft could safely follow. A moment later, their trap wasn't closing. It was falling apart. Most pilots didn't know it yet. But the P-47 had a secret. Its bulk, its weight, the very things pilots mocked, gave it unmatched acceleration in a dive. While other fighters risked tearing their wings off if they pushed too far, the P-47 grew more stable the faster it fell. It was a paradox no one fully understood until men like this pilot started using it in real combat. As he plunged through the cloud layer, the Germans scrambled to react. Some broke formation, some tried to match the angle, others simply stared in disbelief. But one thing became clear. The American pilot wasn't escaping. He was attacking. He pulled up through the bottom of the dive with a momentum that transformed the flying brick into a 2,000 horsepower hammer. In a single rising pass, he cut into the German formation with devastating precision. The first fighter exploded. Another spun away, trailing smoke. The trap collapsed into panic and scattered screams over the radio. And in that moment, brief, violent, undeniable, the P-47 shed its reputation. It wasn't a joke. It wasn't a brick. It wasn't useless. It was a weapon no one had been taught to fear, yet one that would destroy 39 enemy aircraft in a single month. Not because it turned tighter or climbed faster, but because one pilot finally understood what this machine was truly built to do. Long before the P-47 terrified anyone, it embarrassed almost everyone who flew it. Its development began not with confidence but with desperation. The U.S. Army Air Forces needed a high-altitude escort fighter, something fast enough to chase down German interceptors, yet tough enough to survive the brutal air over Europe. What they got instead, at least at first glance, was a monster that looked like it had been designed by committee and then sabotaged by gravity. It weighed nearly twice as much as the sleek, elegant fighters America had promised its pilots. It needed a runway so long that some airfields couldn't support it. It guzzled fuel as if its engine were personally offended by efficiency. And even worse, its silhouette looked wrong. Fighters were supposed to look agile. The P-47 looked like a fat exaggeration of one. The criticism began before the first squadron ever deployed. Test pilots rolled their eyes. Ground crews cursed its maintenance demands. And commanders wondered privately if they had just wasted precious wartime production on an aircraft that might be outdated before it fired a shot. The Luftwaffe laughed loudest of all. German intelligence reports described it dismissively. A clumsy bomber escort with poor turning capability. A crude design relying on brute force, not finesse. A target, not a threat. From a distance, especially from the polished cockpits of Bf 109 seconds and Fevu 190 seconds, the judgment seemed accurate. The P-47 couldn't pirouette through a dogfight. It couldn't match the elegant climbs of German interceptors. Its sheer mass made it sluggish at low speeds, and inexperienced pilots who tried to mimic Spitfire or Mustang tactics sometimes paid with their lives. But history has a habit of punishing those who judge too quickly. Inside the airframe was an engine so powerful it seemed almost excessive. The Pratt & Whitney R-2800, a 2,000-horsepower mechanical hurricane. Wrapped around it was a radial design that could absorb hits that would rip the coolant lines out of any German inline engine. The wings were thick, the fuselage reinforced, and the internal structure brutally overbuilt, as if the designers assumed the pilot would eventually attempt something insane. And they were right, though they never imagined what that insane thing would be. Still, in 1943, none of that mattered. Pilots hated how the aircraft felt. They hated how it looked. They hated that German fighters could dance around them with ease. The P-47 seemed destined for mediocrity, another wartime experiment tolerated out of necessity rather than brilliance. The manuals reinforced the pessimism. They stressed caution, avoid turning duels, avoid head-on passes, avoid attacking unless you hold every advantage. Fly defensively, one instructor told his squadron. Let the enemy make mistakes. This plane won't win a knife fight. Heavier every. But there was a problem with that advice. German pilots rarely made mistakes. In the early months over Europe, P-47 squadrons struggled. Losses mounted. Morale dropped. Some commanders quietly petitioned for replacements, insisting the aircraft had too many flaws to be corrected, too big, too slow to react, too crude to dominate the increasingly deadly skies. Meanwhile, in briefing rooms across occupied Europe, Luftwaffe pilots continued grinning at reconnaissance photos of American escort groups. The big ones? Those were warm-ups. Shoot them down quickly. Save your fuel for the Mustangs and Spitfires. The P-47's reputation sank so low that new pilots sometimes apologized upon being assigned to a Thunderbolt squadron, as though they had been handed a defective tool forced upon them by bureaucracy. But the truth no one saw yet was that the P-47 had been built for a kind of air combat that didn't exist in textbooks. Its strengths weren't subtle. They were explosive, violent, counterintuitive. They made sense only to someone willing to tear up the rulebook and start from physics, not tradition. Most pilots didn't think this way. Most commanders didn't think this way. The Luftwaffe certainly didn't. But one man did. And before long, the very weaknesses that turned the P-47 into a punchline would become the foundation for a new kind of attack, one so brutally effective that German pilots would stop laughing, stop underestimating, and start looking over their shoulders every time they climbed into the bright, unforgiving air over Europe. Because once that tactic was unleashed, the big, clumsy plane they mocked would no longer be the aircraft nobody wanted. It would be the aircraft nobody survived. Long before the Thunderbolt shocked the Luftwaffe, long before German pilots realized their jokes were about to kill them, one man had already stopped laughing. He wasn't the most decorated pilot in the squadron. He wasn't the fastest, the flashiest, or the type who posed beside his aircraft for morale posters. He wasn't even well liked by some of his superiors. But he possessed something rarer than raw skill, a refusal to believe what everyone else insisted was true. Most pilots memorized their manuals. He studied their failures. Most men trusted doctrine. He trusted physics. Most looked at the P-47 and saw a problem. He saw a question. If this plane is so bad, why does it survive so much? His curiosity started long before the fateful month when the Thunderbolt destroyed nearly 40 German fighters. It began quietly in training ranges, maintenance hangars, and long hours staring at the clouds from a cockpit that vibrated like a furnace about to explode. He noticed things other pilots dismissed. The P-47 didn't just fall fast, it wanted to fall fast. When it dove, it didn't wobble like the 109. It didn't threaten to tear itself apart like the Spitfire. It tightened, stabilized, strengthened. Instructors told him this meant nothing. He disagreed. One afternoon, while returning from a routine escort mission, he found himself isolated above a rising swarm of enemy fighters. The Germans saw him instantly, one lone Thunderbolt, too slow to climb, too bulky to turn, too stupid to survive. They moved to intercept. He had seconds to choose. Climb and die, turn and die, run and die. So he did something no manual suggested. He dove, not a controlled descent, not a tactical reposition, a plunge so violent the airframe screamed, the horizon spun, the altimeter blurred, the engine roared like a caged animal finally freed. He felt the crushing weight of speed, the plane straining yet holding, as if the designers had built the wings out of spite. The Germans broke off. They couldn't keep up. One pilot tried. He stalled and fell away, nearly ripping his aircraft apart. The American pilot leveled out miles below, heart hammering, brain racing. He wasn't dead. The plane hadn't snapped. It had behaved as if this insane dive was what it was designed to do. He landed that day not with relief, but with revelation. The Thunderbolt wasn't failing its pilots. Its pilots were failing to understand it. Over the following weeks, he began pushing the aircraft harder. Each dive grew sharper, faster, more precise. He learned how to manipulate energy, how to trade altitude for crushing velocity, how to weaponize gravity against fighters that relied on elegance and agility. His squadron mates thought he was reckless. His superiors thought he was flirting with disaster. Maintenance crews cursed him for stressing the airframe beyond what they believed safe. But he kept going, because physics doesn't care about opinion and the P-47 didn't care about fear. During debriefings, while others argued about turning radius, engine lag, or wing loading, he sketched diagrams showing angles of attack, energy curves, and critical dive speeds. Most officers stared at him like he was speaking another language. Some laughed. He didn't. He had nearly died once. He didn't intend to let anyone else do so because of obsolete doctrine. Then came the moment that cemented everything. A new pilot in his squadron, young, eager, terrified of disappointing the veterans, was caught in a climbing trap set by German fighters. He radioed for help, his voice cracking, surrounded by interceptors far more agile than his Thunderbolt. He tried to escape by turning. That was his mistake. The enemy closed on him instantly. The man who saw what others missed arrived seconds later. He understood the situation at a glance. The rookie couldn't climb, couldn't turn, couldn't outrun them, but he could dive. "Push the nose down," he barked into the radio. "Now." Docked were docked. There was a moment of silence, the kind of silence that decides whether a man lives or dies. Then the rookie obeyed. What followed was a miracle of raw physics. The rookie's aircraft, moments from annihilation, plunged into a dive so unforgiving the Germans couldn't follow without shredding their wings. The squadron leader dove behind him, using his own plane's mass to gain lethal speed. The German trap collapsed. One fighter overshot. Another rolled away, failing to match the angle. The diving Thunderbolt surged upward through the chaos and cut down the closest pursuer in a burst of fire so violent the wreck nearly collided with its own wingman. When both Americans returned to base alive, something changed. The rookie wasn't the same. The squadron wasn't the same. And the man who had given the order felt no triumph, just confirmation. He had been right. The manuals were wrong. The P-47's greatest strength wasn't its guns, its armor, or its size. It was its ability to unleash gravity as a weapon. But his revelation came with a price. Commanders questioned his methods. Instructors protested the danger. Some higher officers accused him of encouraging reckless disregard for doctrine. If you work stever, they didn't understand the truth he had discovered. This wasn't reckless. This was the only way the P-47 could dominate. At altitude, German fighters owned the sky until someone arrived who refused to fight on their terms, and once he proved the dive tactic worked, other pilots began noticing the same pattern. The P-47 wasn't meant to turn. It wasn't meant to dance. It wasn't meant to duel. It was meant to fall hard, fast, and violently, and then rise from that fall as a hammer of steel and fire. In an air war defined by fragile balance and delicate maneuvers, this man embraced the brutality of momentum, and for the first time, American pilots began winning battles they were supposed to lose. One man changed the way a worthless plane was flown, and soon, that change would ignite a month of destruction the Luftwaffe could neither predict nor stop. The morning that changed everything did not begin with urgency. It began with silence, cold, brittle silence, at 27,000 feet. The kind of silence that makes the world feel thin, as if the sky itself is holding its breath. Below the Thunderbolts, the bomber stream crawled toward its target, a vital industrial artery deep inside Germany, a place the Luftwaffe would never allow to fall. The moment the escort pilots saw the first glints rising from the horizon, they knew the Germans were coming not in scattered groups, but in force. Dozens, scores, a wall of fighters climbing with murderous intent. Radio calls snapped through the formation. Bandits, 10 o'clock high. ISO, multiple groups closing fast. Well, Jesus, there are so many of them. As one of 9. And then the voice of the squadron leader, the man who had seen what others missed, cut through the noise. Keep altitude. Watch their climb. They're setting the trap. Daze, because the Germans weren't charging blindly. They were constructing the same upward funnel that had devoured countless escorts before. Trap the Thunderbolts from below. Force them into a turning fight. Cripple the escorts, then tear the bombers apart. Against Spitfires, it was lethal. Against early P-51 seconds, it was brutal. Against the P-47, by every doctrine ever written, it was supposed to be unstoppable. One of the rookies broke first. "Sir, they're already above the bombers. Should we turn to meet them?" He stayed. "Negative," the leader answered. "They want you to turn." It bagged Deviros. It was a chilling truth. Turning meant death. Climbing meant death. Holding formation meant waiting to die. The Luftwaffe closed in with predatory precision. Their engines glowed. Their wings glittered with ice crystals, their superior climb rates dragging them up and over the Americans like wolves circling trapped prey. The squadron leader exhaled once, slowly. "On my order," he said. "We drop." Oh, the rookies froze. Drop? Into 80 enemy fighters? But his voice remained calm, almost surgical. "They can outturn us. They can outclimb us. But they can't outrun gravity. We strike from the dive. No turning." As act, silence flooded the channel. Then, "Bombers under attack. We need support." Very plies, it was time. The Germans dove first, exactly as doctrine demanded, pouring down from above in a coordinated strike aimed at the escorts. Their goal was simple: break the escort screen, open a corridor, and carve through the bombers like razors through cloth. The leader watched the enemy commit. Now, well, 20 Thunderbolts pitched downward in unison, not drifting, not escaping, plunging. What the Germans expected to be a defensive panic became a controlled, synchronized descent that no manual had ever described. The Thunderbolts didn't falter. They didn't wobble. They accelerated. Faster, faster, faster. The airframes groaned, wings shuddering as if the bolts holding them together were moments from ripping free. But the P-47 thrived in the chaos. At these speeds, it transformed from a clumsy brute into a falling weapon, the kind of weapon the Luftwaffe had never trained to counter. The German formation began to deform, uncertain. Some pilots tried to follow the angle. Some tried to cut across it. Some hesitated, expecting the Americans to pull up. They didn't. The leader dove deeper, pushing the Thunderbolt beyond anything the Germans believed possible. His airspeed indicator slammed toward the red line. He felt the controls stiffen, felt the aircraft sink into a terrifying but stable tunnel of raw, crushing velocity. This was the P-47's domain. Not the turn, Not the climb, the fall. He pulled up through the bottom of the dive with a surge of momentum so violent it felt like the air itself was snapping open. His guns blazed. A German fighter disintegrated in front of him, breaking apart in a flash of flame and metal shards. The rest of his squadron erupted upward behind him, each using their dive energy like a catapult. The sky, moments earlier a clean German trap, devolved into chaos. The Luftwaffe tried to adapt. They couldn't. Their elegant fighters stalled when they tried to follow. Their wings threatened to shear off at Thunderbolt speeds. Their tight formation, so perfect seconds before, became a confused mess of overshoots, panicked breakaways, and sudden evasive rolls. The young pilot who had survived his earlier ambush found himself in the perfect position. A German fighter streaked across his nose, overshooting wildly. He squeezed the trigger. Tracers tore through the enemy's fuselage, sending it spiraling into the cloud layer. "Splash one!" he shouted, disbelief cracking his voice. Another Thunderbolt surged upward, using the last of its dive energy to shred an FW-190, trying desperately to reform the attack. 2 minutes into the battle, the trap was gone. 4 minutes in, the Germans were scattering. 5 minutes in, the bombers were safe. The impossible had happened. The outnumbered, underestimated Thunderbolts had broken one of the Luftwaffe's most reliable attack strategies, not through finesse, not through precision turning, but through controlled violence, pure physics, and a tactic that no American manual had ever endorsed. By the time the Thunderbolts regrouped, the radios were filled with shocked whispers. "What the hell just happened?" 18-7. "How did we do that?" "Did you see their formation fall apart? Had a desk eye?" The squadron leader said nothing at first. He simply looked down at the battered gloves on his hands, hands that had nearly torn themselves apart months earlier when he discovered the dive by accident. Finally, he keyed his radio. "That," he said, "is how this plane fights, Doc." No one argued, no one laughed. And from that day forward, no one called the Thunderbolt a joke again. It had survived the impossible. It had killed inside a perfect German trap. And soon, as reports circulated through command, it would change everything. When the Thunderbolts returned from that impossible battle, the airfield wasn't loud. It was confused. Ground crews expected wrecks. Pilots expected reprimands. Commanders expected explanations wrapped in excuses. After all, the squadron had broken formation, dived out of altitude, and executed a maneuver that every training officer swore was either reckless, suicidal, or both. But the Thunderbolts didn't limp home. They rolled in clean. Their guns were hot, and the sky behind them, so often filled with German fighters, was empty. The first crew chief who climbed onto a wing froze when he saw the kill markings. "3? You got 3? He stomped it. The pilot didn't answer. He was still trying to process what had happened. Then the rookie stepped down from his cockpit, still shaking. "I didn't turn once," he said quietly. "I didn't have to." Well, word spread across the base faster than the returning aircraft could taxi. A squadron had broken a German trap head-on. The Luftwaffe, masters of altitude, energy, and precision, had been forced into disarray by a maneuver no American commander had ever authorized. Within an hour, senior officers demanded reports. Within 2 hours, intelligence officers asked for gun camera reels. Within 3 hours, analysts from 3 different commands were arguing over whether the results were exaggerated, misinterpreted, or outright impossible. The Thunderbolt wasn't supposed to win that kind of fight. Not outnumbered, not outpositioned, not under a perfect Luftwaffe setup. Yet it had, and nothing created fear in a bureaucracy quite like a victory that didn't follow the rules. By evening, the squadron leader found himself in a cramped, smoky briefing room, surrounded by officers who weren't sure whether to congratulate him or court-martial him. Charts covered the walls. Gun camera footage flickered across a projector screen. Analysts rewound and replayed the same seconds again and again. The footage didn't lie. German fighters overshooting. Fu-190 wings, fluttering at lethal flutter speeds. Thunderbolts rising from their dives like slingshots, punching straight through enemy formations. Kill after kill after kill. One colonel stared at the screen, jaw tight. "Explain to me," he said, "how your men survived that." Their sighed. The leader didn't deliver a speech. He simply pointed at the image frozen on the wall, a P-47 dropping at an absurd angle, control surfaces rigid, the airframe stable despite the crushing speed. "That's how," he said. "This plane isn't meant to turn, it's meant to fall. And if we use that fall correctly, they can't stop us." Israeli 1906. Silence. Cold. Uncomfortable. Some officers hated it. Some refused to accept it. But they couldn't ignore the numbers. The Thunderbolts had protected the bombers. They had shattered an elite German formation. They had suffered minimal losses. And the Luftwaffe, so proud of its doctrine, so confident in its traps, had cracked under a tactic they had never trained to counter. That night, unofficial rumors began spreading across nearby airfields. "Did you hear? A squadron dove straight through a German ambush. Duargadid. They say the 47 can outrun anything in a dive." Is one man? No, really anything. Those know. Pilots from other groups sought out the squadron leader. They wanted to know the angles, the throttle settings, the entry speeds. They wanted to know how he had made a heavy machine look untouchable, but he refused to turn physics into folklore. "This isn't a trick," he told them. "It's energy. Control it or die." Deck in around it. Still, the rumors grew. Some said the P-47 had been secretly modified. Others claimed the squadron had stumbled onto a classified tactic. A few insisted the Germans had made a rare mistake. But the truth was simpler and far more dangerous. A single pilot had forced the entire air war to acknowledge something the manuals never admitted. The P-47 wasn't broken. The thinking behind it was. In the days that followed, field reports from German intercept squadrons painted a picture no Allied planner expected. Pilots complained that Thunderbolts were diving past safe pursuit speeds. Others warned that attacking from above was now highly risky because the Americans seemed willing and able to counter-dive with lethal force. One frustrated German pilot wrote, "We cannot catch the heavy one in the fall. We lose them. And when they rise again, they are already behind us." Inside German command, officers initially dismissed these claims. Everything they knew said the Thunderbolt shouldn't behave this way. Everything they trained for assumed it couldn't. But the losses were real, and getting worse. By the end of that month, the P-47's dive tactic, once an accident, then a heresy, had become a whispered secret shared between pilots. They didn't announce it. They didn't publish it. They didn't revise manuals yet. They simply used it again and again and again, and in that single month, Thunderbolt units destroyed nearly 40 German fighters, an avalanche of kills that shook both sides of the war. It wasn't luck. It wasn't chance. It wasn't miracle. It was the moment the P-47 slipped out of its old identity and stepped into its real purpose. A plane built for falling had finally found someone willing to let it fall. For months, pilots had argued about the P-47 as if it were a philosophical problem. Too heavy, too slow, too clumsy. But physics doesn't care about opinions. And the sky doesn't care about what a fighter should be. It only cares about what a fighter is. What the Germans didn't understand, what most Americans didn't understand either, was that the P-47 wasn't built for the same kind of war the Spitfire and the 109 were fighting. It wasn't a duelist. It wasn't a knife fighter. It wasn't engineered for elegant turns or graceful climbs. It was engineered for something far more primitive, far more brutal, far more decisive. It was built to store energy like a falling anvil, the secret hidden in the weight. From the first day the Thunderbolt left the factory, its greatest flaw was obvious: mass. It weighed more than some bombers did a decade earlier. Pilots swore at it. Instructors complained. Commanders tried to justify it. But mass is only a flaw when you fight in the horizontal. When you fight in the vertical, it becomes a weapon. Because what no one bothered to consider until one stubborn pilot forced them to was that a heavier aircraft, when it dives, behaves like a hammer dropped from the sky. It doesn't just gain speed, it accelerates harder, faster, longer. While German fighters, light and finely tuned, approached their structural limits in a deep dive, the P-47 remained brutally stable. The airframe didn't flutter, the wings didn't twist, the cooling system didn't fail, the engine didn't choke. The Thunderbolt devoured altitude like a predator starved for months, and the deeper the dive, the stronger it became. The Germans hit a wall, they didn't know existed. German fighters were masterpieces of engineering, at least on paper. Their inline engines gave them speed and elegance. Their wings were thin and agile. Their climb rates were exceptional. But every masterpiece has a weakness. At extreme speeds, the Bf-109's controls stiffened until the aircraft responded like a block of steel. The FW-190, though sturdier, risked catastrophic flutter if pushed too far into the red. Both designs relied on airframes optimized for agility, not punishment. When they tried to follow a diving P-47, they hit limits the Americans didn't share. Wings shuddered. Control surface locked. Structural warning tones screamed through the cockpit. A Thunderbolt could dive past 480 miles per hour without tearing itself apart. A German fighter could not. To chase it was to gamble with your life. To ignore it was to die when it came back up. The real trick: energy turned into violence. The dive wasn't just about escape speed. It was about using gravity as ammunition. When the P-47 bottomed out and pulled into a climbing curve, all that stored energy transformed into a blast of upward momentum the Germans simply could not match. They were lighter, but in this domain, lightness was a curse. An FTU-190 exiting a dive was like a feather thrown upward. A P-47 exiting a dive was a stone fired from a catapult. That difference, those seconds when the Thunderbolt surged upward with impossible force, created openings no turning fight could ever produce. Enemy fighters overshot. They stalled. They floated directly into the Thunderbolt's guns. The sky above Europe, once a place of elegant maneuvers and practiced turns, suddenly rewarded the pilot, who was willing to weaponize gravity itself. The manuals hid this because no one thought this way. The most astonishing truth is that the dive tactic wasn't secret because it was classified. It was secret because no one imagined it. American doctrine worshipped turning ability. German doctrine worshipped altitude advantage. British doctrine worshipped climb performance. But no doctrine worshipped mass. No doctrine worshipped brute force acceleration. No doctrine worshipped the idea that a fighter could win by falling harder than the enemy. So, the knowledge lived only where innovation always begins, in a cockpit, not in a classroom. A single pilot had noticed the plane's strange stability in a dive. He had dared to push it further. He had survived long enough to understand it. Once he taught others, the results became undeniable. Why the Luftwaffe couldn't adapt in time? German tacticians weren't stupid. They understood energy fighting. They understood altitude control. They understood the importance of momentum. But they didn't understand the Thunderbolt. And worse, they didn't have the luxury of time. By the time intelligence officers realized the Americans were using the dive as a primary offensive tool, their own losses had stacked too high. Training new pilots took months. Teaching them new doctrine took even longer. Germany, bled by years of war, didn't have months. The Thunderbolt did not destroy the Luftwaffe by superiority. It destroyed it by timing. The Germans learned the truth only after it was already killing them. The joke they had mocked for a year was becoming the most efficient executioner in the European sky. A plane built for survival became a plane built for destruction. The P-47's strengths, its engine, its weight, its durability, were accidental advantages in a new kind of vertical warfare. What designers had intended as robustness became, in reality, a weapon that turned the rules of aerial combat upside down, a weapon that punished anything light, elegant, or fragile, a weapon that rewarded ruthlessness instead of refinement. And once pilots learned how to unleash that brutality, the Luftwaffe finally understood the truth. You don't beat a Thunderbolt in the turn. You don't beat it in the climb. You don't beat it in the dive. Because in the dive, the Thunderbolt isn't fighting you. It's fighting gravity. And gravity never loses. The first time the Thunderbolts broke a German trap, the victory felt like an anomaly, an unexpected burst of luck. The second time, skeptics insisted it was situational. The third time, analysts quietly admitted something uncomfortable. This wasn't luck. This wasn't circumstance. This was a shift, a tectonic shift. The air war over Europe was built on an architecture of assumptions that had governed tactics since 1940. German fighters dominated through altitude. British and American fighters relied on turn radius, climb rate, or tight formations. Everyone believed that agility, finesse, and quick reactions triumphed in the vast emptiness of the sky. But the P-47 didn't care about finesse. It didn't dance. It punished. Every time a German formation prepared a precise, high-altitude ambush, the Thunderbolts shattered it by refusing the duel and embracing the dive. By late 1943, bomber crews began noticing something strange in their gun sight mirrors. Thunderbolts weren't hovering above them anymore, waiting to defend. They were hunting. Instead of circling above the bombers like sheepdogs, they patrolled at higher altitude, waiting for the Luftwaffe to climb, overextend, commit. The moment the German formations tilted into their downward attack run, the Thunderbolts dove hard, fast, merciless, splitting disciplined formations into chaos. Suddenly, the Luftwaffe's most reliable tactic, attacking from above with numerical superiority, became a liability. Momentum no longer belonged to the climber. It belonged to the one who fell, and no one fell like a P-47. The bombers finally breathed. Bomber crews, hundreds of men whose lives hung in the balance of every escort decision, felt the shift first. They had seen too many missions end in horror. Engines burning, wings snapping, bombers spiraling into the endless farmland below. But now something was different. German fighters were breaking off earlier. Their attacks were less coordinated. Their performance dropped under the stress of trying to counter a tactic that ignored the rules they trained under. One bomber pilot later wrote, "It felt like the sky changed allegiance. The Germans stopped owning the high ground. If we dades, when the Thunderbolts dove, they didn't just protect the bombers, they bought them time. Seconds in which a gunner could lock on target. Seconds in which a formation could tighten. Seconds that meant survival. And survival meant bombs reached their targets. Targets that Germany desperately needed to protect. The data terrified German command. By winter, German intelligence officers began noticing a devastating pattern. Escort losses were dropping, yet interception losses were rising sharply. Luftwaffe squadrons that once executed flawless attacks were returning scattered, damaged, or not returning at all. Pilots complained of American fighters appearing out of nowhere. They complained of losing enemies in the dive. They complained of Thunderbolts surviving hits that would kill any German plane. But the worst reports came from seasoned veterans, the aces. These were men who dominated the air earlier in the war. They had fought Spitfires, Hurricanes, Mustangs, and Lightnings. They knew how to read an enemy aircraft at a glance, and yet they reported the same nightmare. The heavy one is faster than it should be. Our attacks are being reversed. They dive through us. It's a parting. We cannot reform after the first pass. They force us apart. Well, is another snow. The Luftwaffe wasn't just losing aircraft. It was losing rhythm, losing doctrine, losing initiative. Once the Germans lost initiative, the war began eating them alive. Doctrine that took years was broken in weeks. For years, the Luftwaffe built its superiority on altitude, discipline, and numbers. One precise strike could cripple a bomber raid. One well-timed climb could break the escort screen. But the Thunderbolt's dive changed the geometry of air combat. The vertical axis belonged to America now. Every tactic that relied on controlled descents or cautious dives crumbled. German formations couldn't afford to push into the red line. Thunderbolts lived there. German engines overheated in punishing angles. Thunderbolts thrived. German pilots relied on brief, decisive bursts of combat. Thunderbolts dragged them into chaotic, unpredictable energy fights. Air combat was no longer a duel. It was physics, raw, merciless physics. And the pilots who understood it didn't need to outfly anyone. They only needed to outthink them. The sky became a one-way arena. Once American squadrons adopted the dive tactic, the Thunderbolt's reputation transformed almost overnight. The enemy stopped underestimating it. The bombers stopped fearing its limitations. And the pilots who once apologized for being assigned to a P-47 unit now walked with a swagger that hadn't existed months earlier, because they weren't flying a mistake. They were flying a weapon uniquely suited for European skies. A weapon that punished overconfidence. A weapon that broke formations. A weapon that inverted the hierarchy of aerial combat. And as the Thunderbolts tore holes through the Luftwaffe's tactics, The air war over Germany shifted from a contest into a decline the Germans could measure, a decline they could feel, a decline they could not stop, all because one plane, one pilot, one idea rewrote the rules. Long before his name appeared in combat reports, long before commanders whispered about a pilot who had turned a flying joke into a nightmare for the Luftwaffe, he was simply a young man who refused to be ordinary. He had no glamorous background, no pedigree, no polished academy reputation. He wasn't the type the military celebrated in posters. He didn't give fiery speeches. He didn't radiate heroism. He was quiet, observant, stubborn in a way that made instructors uncomfortable. He questioned everything, not to challenge authority, but because he needed things to make sense. In the sky, where so much depended on instinct, he relied on reason. Where others trusted tradition, he trusted patterns. Where others accepted doctrine, he searched for the flaw inside it. He had grown up fascinated by motion cars, wind, the snap of a ball thrown just right. He once told a friend that the world made more sense when it was moving. Maybe that was why the cockpit felt like home. Up there, gravity, drag, lift, energy. All the invisible forces that confused others became companions he could predict, almost feel. But genius comes at a cost, and his cost was isolation. While other pilots bonded over barroom swagger and the shared bravado of youth, he spent evenings studying maintenance notes, learning how the engine breathed under pressure, memorizing the limits of metal. He wasn't trying to outsmart anyone. He was trying to survive a war he knew wouldn't tolerate ignorance. His squadron respected him, but they didn't understand him. Some called him obsessive. Some called him reckless. One commander suggested he thinks too much for a fighter pilot. No, but war has a cruel way of revealing who is right. He never wanted to be a hero. Heroes chase glory. He chased understanding. When he discovered the P-47's dive potential, he didn't grin with pride or boast about rewriting the rulebook. His first reaction was anger that no one had seen it sooner, anger that pilots had died because they were told to fight the wrong battles in the wrong way. He wasn't proud of being different. He was frustrated that being different was necessary. And when his squadron began surviving battles no one expected them to, he credited the aircraft, not himself. "It's not me," he told a young pilot who insisted he'd saved the squadron's lives. "It's the machine. It always knew what it could do. We just didn't." Be dad, but the truth was bitter and undeniable. The machine didn't know anything. He had discovered it. The weight he carried wasn't the planes. After every mission, when cheers erupted and victory tallies were painted onto fuselages, he stayed behind. He would walk the flight line, touching the scorched metal of each aircraft, eyes lingering on the empty spaces where certain planes should have been. Every pilot loss cut through him in ways he never admitted out loud. He remembered names, not scores, faces, not victories, conversations spoken hours before the sky claimed another man. He remembered the rookie he had saved with the first dive tactic, but he also remembered the rookies he couldn't save, the ones who tried to fight the P-47 like a Spitfire and paid for it with everything they had. War recorded numbers. He remembered ghosts. And as the Thunderbolt's legend grew, as German pilots began to fear the shadow of its dive, he felt no triumph, only weight, because he knew exactly how close the Thunderbolt was to becoming a tragedy. One wrong pull, one misread angle, one misjudged entry speed. He had learned the tactic through terror, not theory. He had survived by inches. He had led men into a style of combat so violent that even success felt stolen. The legacy he never claimed. By the time analysts finally acknowledged the dive tactic, his name appeared in reports across multiple commands. Some labeled him an innovator, others a maverick. A few used the word visionary. Dadders know him. He hated all of them. To him, there was no glory in surviving a war where others did not. There was no comfort in invention when invention was born from desperation. And there was no joy in being right when the cost of proving it was measured in lives. He once wrote in a letter that he hoped people would remember the pilots who didn't return, not the ones who made it home. But history has no interest in modesty. And the truth is this: without him, the Thunderbolt would have remained a misunderstood machine. Without him, countless bomber crews would have died under German guns. Without him, the dive tactic might never have emerged at all, not in time, not fast enough, not before the Luftwaffe inflicted far greater damage. He wasn't just a pilot. He was the man who translated physics into survival, the man who turned a flaw into a weapon, the man who made the impossible battle winnable. And though he never claimed the title, he became what the Thunderbolt had always needed: a mind sharp enough to see its truth and a will strong enough to prove it. Long before Allied pilots understood the Thunderbolt, German pilots misunderstood it. At first, the P-47 barely earned their attention. It was big, it was slow to turn. It climbed like a wounded animal. And when German squadrons intercepted bomber streams, the Thunderbolts seemed to lumber into battle with all the subtlety of an engine block thrown into the sky. Veterans of the Eastern Front, hardened by years of savage dogfights, scoffed at it. To them, American fighters were soft machines, built by a nation with factories instead of battle scars. So when German formations saw a group of P-47 seconds at altitude, they didn't tense, they relaxed, they smirked, they tightened their gloves with the easy confidence of hunters preparing for routine work. But the routine ended abruptly, violently, on days when the Thunderbolts refused to turn. That was the first sign something was wrong. They do not respond as they should, do ever. Intelligence logs from late 1943 record the earliest complaints. German pilots reported that Thunderbolts, instead of engaging or retreating, were dropping without hesitation into impossibly steep dives. At first, commanders assumed the Americans were panicking. A frightened pilot might dive too hard. A rookie might misjudge his limits. But seasoned interceptors noticed something chilling. The Americans were diving on purpose. And worse, they were diving correctly. 1 for 190 Ace wrote in a frustrated mission report, "We descend to attack. They descend faster. We brake to reposition. They rise behind us." Aye, this wasn't panic. This was precision. The moment Luftwaffe pilots realized the trap was reversed. The Luftwaffe prided itself on discipline. Combat formations were rehearsed until they felt like instinct, but nothing in their training accounted for a fighter that accelerated in a dive like a falling meteor. One German pilot described the first time he tried to follow a Thunderbolt down. "At first I believed he had lost control. Then I realized I had." Just. His 190 shook violently. His control stick stiffened like frozen metal. Warning lights flickered. The airspeed needle quivered past the edge of sanity. He broke off the pursuit, because to keep following meant tearing himself out of the sky. Below him, the P-47 did not break apart. It did not lose stability. It did not slow. It simply vanished. Moments later, it reappeared behind him. That experience repeated across squadrons. A pilot who survived the encounter called it a ghost attack. They fall, then rise where no aircraft should be. He's what? Fear, once unthinkable, began creeping into cockpits. The enemy's respect came late and hard. As more Thunderbolts entered combat, German pilots noticed patterns they could not explain. They ignore our turning fight. They attack with speed we cannot match. It is refall. They absorb damage that destroys our aircraft. Nose. They force us to scatter. Expy. One mission debrief from JG-26, a famed Luftwaffe fighter wing, contains a terse sentence rarely seen in German combat logs. Avoid extended diving engagements with Thunderbolts. A pribe. That sentence alone signaled disaster. A tactic was no longer reliable. An assumption was no longer valid. And once assumptions fail in the air, lives follow. The breaking point. Veterans, the men who once treated the P-47 like a warm-up target, began reporting the same nightmare. Thunderbolts appeared above them. Not behind, not ahead, above. That meant only one thing. The Americans had taken the high ground. When the Thunderbolts dove, German formations dissolved. Order collapsed. Pairs separated. Wingmen lost contact. One pilot wrote, "I saw my entire formation shatter in seconds. They did not defeat us, they unmade us." And, daughter, the Luftwaffe's greatest strength, its discipline became meaningless against an enemy that attacked with raw momentum instead of delicate maneuvers. And worst of all, the Germans realized the Americans weren't improvising, they were learning. Every week, The Thunderbolts grew more precise, more coordinated, more ruthless. The dive tactic was no longer a rumor. It was an institution. By the time German intelligence fully understood the physics behind the Thunderbolt's new style of fighting, the damage was irreversible. The hunters had become the hunted. And the P-47, the plane they once mocked, had become the last silhouette any German pilot wanted to see dropping out of the sun. In the quiet decades after the war, when museums replaced runways and polished floors replaced muddy airfields, the P-47 Thunderbolt often sat in the shadow of sleeker legends. Visitors gravitated toward the Spitfire's elegance, the Mustang's grace, the 109's predatory silhouette. The Thunderbolt, broad-shouldered and unapologetically bulky, seemed out of place, an artifact that didn't fit the story most people thought they knew. It looked too heavy to be heroic, too blunt to be brilliant, too crude to be remembered. But metal does not tell its own story. People do. And people, over time, forgot the truth. Forgot how crews watched Thunderbolts limp home with cylinders shot out, oil pouring from holes big enough to put a fist through. Forgot how bomber formation survived because a single squadron of P-47 seconds refused to break. Forgot how German pilots' aces with years of experience stared in disbelief as the flying refrigerator dropped out of the sun like a blade. Forgot that the plane they mocked became the one they feared. The dive tactic that changed everything never appeared in the early manuals. It wasn't written by engineers or professors of aerodynamics or committees in quiet rooms. It came from a cockpit, from a man who refused to believe the aircraft he flew was destined for mediocrity. And history, as it often does, nearly buried that man's contribution beneath tonnage figures and manufacturing statistics. Many accounts credit the Thunderbolt's engine, its rugged build, its 8 50 caliber guns. Those things mattered, but none of them explain the transformation. Machines don't innovate. People do. The P-47 didn't reinvent itself. Someone reinvented how to fly it. The strength no one wanted to admit. The Thunderbolt never fit the romantic image of a fighter. It didn't slice through clouds, it punched through them. It didn't perform acrobatics, it endured them. It didn't glide, it dragged the sky with it. But in war, beauty doesn't win. Understanding does. Once pilots accepted the Thunderbolt for what it was, not what it wasn't, the aircraft became a force that no German tactic could reliably defeat. The dive turned its mass into momentum. The climb after the dive turned that momentum into violence. Its durability turned mistakes that killed other pilots into survivable lessons. It was not a duelist. It was a breaker of formations, a disruptor of doctrine, a weapon of vertical dominance. This was the part of the story that disappeared when the war ended, not because it was unimportant, but because it was inconvenient. The narrative preferred elegance and agility. The Thunderbolt offered neither. What it offered was raw, unfiltered effectiveness. And effectiveness wins wars. Why the legend still matters. Today, most people who walk past a Thunderbolt display see a relic, an odd-looking brute from a distant era. They don't see the fear it inspired. They don't hear the chaos it brought to Luftwaffe formations. They don't feel the tension of a cockpit rattling at terminal velocity while a pilot trusted a machine no one else believed in. They don't know that underneath its unromantic exterior lived one of the most misunderstood revolutions in aerial warfare. A revolution born from a simple truth. What seems weak may simply be used incorrectly. What seems ugly may simply be engineered for a different purpose. What seems useless may simply be waiting for the right mind to reveal its power. The Thunderbolt proved that brilliance can hide inside the least likely machine. It proved that the enemy's laughter can be the first step toward their defeat. It proved that innovation often arrives not from designing something new, but from understanding something old in a new way. The plane that refused to stay in the shadow. Long after the pilots who flew it are gone, long after the manuals have yellowed and the airfields have disappeared beneath grass, one truth remains unshakable. The P-47 was not the plane its critics believed it was. It was the plane its enemies learned to fear. A plane that turned gravity into a weapon. A plane that shattered doctrine with a dive. A plane that, for one brutal and decisive month, destroyed 39 enemy fighters and changed the course of the air war. A plane that earned a legacy not through elegance, but through undeniable, unignorable power. And the next time someone walks past its wide fuselage and laughs the way German pilots once did, they'll be repeating a mistake history has already corrected. A mistake paid for in wreckage, in tactics rewritten, in skies reclaimed. Because this useless plane didn't just survive the war. It shaped it. If this story made you rethink what a useless machine can become, there are dozens more waiting just beneath the surface of World War II. Stories twisted by time, stories buried under myth, stories that deserve to be told the way they truly happened. Tell me in the comments, which forgotten aircraft, tactic, or battle should we uncover next? And if you want more untold war stories, brought to life with the same depth and honesty, make sure you subscribe. There is always another myth to break, another truth to reveal, another forgotten chapter waiting to be opened.